London after midnight, the atmospheric history of Victorian nightlife. Before we step into the fog tonight, tell me, Heb, you ever wondered what the night sounded like before the hum of modern electricity took over? What it felt like to walk through streets lit only by the amber glow of gas lamps, where shadows stretched long and mysterious across rain-slicked cobblestones. Tonight, we're going to discover together the atmospheric world of Victorian London after dark. A city that transformed completely once the sun dipped below the horizon, revealing an entirely different character, one both beautiful and haunting, bustling and serene. All at once, close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing on a London street corner in the year 1885. As the last rays of daylight begin their slow retreat from the city, the air around you grows cooler, damper, carrying with it the mingled sense of coal smoke, horse manure, and somewhere in the distance, the yeasty warmth of a bakery preparing for tomorrow's bread. This is the London of gaslight and fog, of hansom cabs and coffee stalls, of night watchmen with their rattles and lamplighters with their long poles. This is London after midnight, and tonight we walk its streets together. The twilight hour, the transition from day to night in Victorian London, was not the sudden thing we know today, with the flick of a switch flooding rooms with instant brilliance. No, it was a gradual, almost ceremonial affair, a slow dimming of the world that began long before the sun actually set, as if the city itself was preparing for the costume change between its daytime persona and its nocturnal self. The light in London during these late afternoon hours possessed a particular quality, diffused through the ever-present haze of coal smoke that hung over the city like a perpetual veil, turning the sun into a pale copper disk that seemed to hover rather than sink, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. As 4 o'clock approached during the winter months, which stretched long and dark across the calendar from November through February, the clerks and shopkeepers of the city would begin to feel that familiar pull toward home, that deep-seated human instinct to retreat to shelter before darkness claimed the streets entirely. The great counting houses of the city, those temples of commerce where fortunes were made and lost on the strength of a signature, would see their gas jets lit earlier and earlier as the season progressed, the blue-white flames adding their own particular scent to the atmosphere, smell that was somehow both clean and acrid at once, a peculiar chemical perfume that marked the spaces of the wealthy and the modern. But before we follow these workers home, let us pause and watch the ritual that marked the boundary between London's day and night for lighting of the lamps. In the soft glow of the fading day, figures would appear on the streets as if summoned by the approaching darkness itself. These were the lamplighters, men who moved through the city with practiced efficiency, their long poles balanced on their shoulders, carrying with them the means to push back the night, if only by a few feet at a time. Each lamplighter was responsible for a particular route, a circuit of perhaps 50 or 60 lamps that he would visit twice daily, once at dusk to light them, once at dawn to extinguish them. The lamplighter's ladder would rest against the horizontal bar that projected from each lamppost, a feature designed specifically for this purpose, and he would ascend with the casual grace of long practice. Inside the lamp, a small flame burned constantly as a pilot light, and the lamplighter needed only to turn a valve to allow the gas to flow freely, whereupon the flame would bloom into full brightness, casting its warm but modest circle of light onto the pavement below. The sound of this work formed its own music in the twilight streets, the soft thud of the ladder being positioned, the metallic clink as it made contact with the iron bar, the creak of hinges as the lamp's glass housing was opened, and then, if you listened carefully, the soft whoosh as the gas caught flame and the light swelled, one by one, like flowers opening in some strange nocturnal garden. The gas lamps would bloom along the length of each street. The effect was not one of comprehensive illumination, as we might expect today, but rather of pools of warm light separated by stretches of relative darkness. On a major thoroughfare, like Oxford Street or the Strand, lamps might stand 65 meters apart, each one casting a glow that reached perhaps 15 to 20 feet in any direction. The light itself was not the harsh white of modern streetlights, but a softer, yellower radiance that seemed almost to drip from the lamp like honey, illuminating the immediate vicinity while allowing the spaces between to retain their mystery and shadows. The quality of this light cannot be overstated in its importance to understanding Victorian London at night. A single gas lamp, burning at its brightest, produced roughly the equivalent of what we would today consider a 25-watt incandescent bulb. Imagine trying to navigate a modern street lit only by such dim sources placed 65 meters apart, and you begin to understand the challenge and the strangeness of Victorian nighttime travel. The light was sufficient to create orientation points, distant beacons toward which one could aim while walking through the darkness between. But it was not enough to banish the night entirely or to render the streets as legible as they were during the day. As the lamplighters made their rounds, the city around them continued its transformation. The omnibuses that had rattled up and down the major routes during the day, those top-heavy vehicles drawn by pairs of tired horses, would begin their final runs, carrying homeward the last of the clerks and shop assistants. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones created a constant rumble that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the city, punctuated by the clop of hooves and the occasional shout of a driver trying to navigate through traffic. Even as daylight waned, the streets remained congested. For London in the 1880s was home to more than 4 million souls, and all of them, it seemed, had urgent business that required the use of the public roadways, the cab stands, those designated spots where hansom cabs waited for custom, would begin to see a change of guard around this hour. The day cabmen, who had been at work since 9 in the morning, their hansoms and four-wheelers cleaned and bright from the washers' hands, would be thinking of that blessed moment when they could return to the yard, hand over the reins, and make their way home to whatever modest lodging they called their own. Meanwhile, the night cabmen, looking somewhat fresher and more alert than their weary daytime counterparts, would be taking up their positions, preparing for the evening trade that would come from the theatres and music halls, from dinner parties and social calls, from all the various entertainments and obligations that filled the hours between dusk and dawn for those who could afford them. Inside the shops along the major commercial streets, a different kind of lighting ceremony would be taking place. The great plate glass windows that had become a feature of modern retail establishments would be illuminated from within, creating brilliant displays that seemed almost magical in the gathering darkness. Gas jets placed strategically throughout the shop interior would be lit, and their combined glow, focused and amplified by careful positioning of mirrors and reflective surfaces, would turn these windows into glowing stages where goods were displayed like actors in a play. The effect was intentional and calculated, had long understood that the contrast between the darkness of the street and the brightness of their windows drew the eye and encouraged the passer-by to pause, to look, and perhaps to enter and purchase. This practice of keeping shops open into the evening hours was a relatively recent innovation. made possible only by the advent of gaslighting. In earlier times, when candles and oil lamps were the only sources of artificial light, the expense and difficulty of illumination had meant that businesses closed when daylight failed. But gas changed everything, extending the commercial day and creating what some observers called daylight by night, though this was perhaps an overstatement given the actual modest illumination provided. Still, to walk down a major shopping street like Regent Street or Piccadilly during these twilight hours was to experience something that would have been impossible a generation earlier, a nighttime world that glittered and beckoned, that promised warmth and light and the satisfaction of commerce, even as darkness crept across the city. Yet not everyone experienced this transition in the same way. For the working poor, for the casual labourers of the docks and the street sellers who eked out their existence on the margins of the city's economy, the coming of night meant something quite different. It meant the end of the possibility of earning that day, the closing of opportunities until tomorrow's dawn. The dock workers who had gathered at the gates each morning for the call-on, hoping to be selected for a day's labour, and who had not been chosen, would drift away as twilight deepened, faces set in resignation or desperation depending on their circumstances. Some would seek the warmth and companionship of a public house, spending precious pennies on beer that might have been better saved for rent or food. Others would simply begin the walk back to whatever corner of the East End they called home, through streets that grew darker and more forbidding with each passing minute. For those with homes to go to, the evening commute was its own experience, one that varied dramatically based on one's social standing and economic means. The wealthy might travel in their own carriages, enclosed broughams with their leather interiors and brass fittings, driven by liveried coachmen who knew the way home as well as they knew their own names. The middle classes might take a hansom cab, that marvel of Victorian engineering with its sleek two-wheeled design, its driver perched high at the back, its passengers enclosed in the carriage below with folding doors to protect their legs from mud splashed up by the horses' hooves. For the lower middle classes and the better-paid working men, there were the omnibuses, those crowded, uncomfortable but affordable conveyances that made their way through the streets with a kind of plodding determination, stopping frequently to allow passengers to board or alight. And then there were those who simply walked, for whom no other option existed due to either poverty or proximity. These pedestrians would navigate the increasingly dark streets by memory and instinct as much as by sight, keeping to the routes they knew, aware of which corners were safe and which were best avoided, which alleys offered shortcuts, and which were the domain of those who made their living by separating the unwary from their possessions. The streets of Victorian London, even the main thoroughfares, were not the safe, well-lit corridors we might imagine. Crime was a constant concern, especially after dark, and those who could afford it might hire a link boy, though by the 1880s this practice was dying out, to light their way home with a torch. The transition from day to night was also marked by a change in the sensory landscape of the city. The sounds that had dominated the daylight hours, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares, the general bustle of commercial activity, the clatter of construction work would begin to fade, replaced by a different audio tapestry. The clip-clop of hooves continued, but seemed somehow more pronounced in the quieter evening air. The rumble of carriage wheels over cobblestones created a baseline drone that was ever present, like the breathing of some great urban creature. From the public houses, as doors opened and closed, would come bursts of sound laughter, raised voices, the tinny notes of a piano being enthusiastically, if not skillfully played. The smell of the city changed to his day gave way to night. The coal smoke that was always present would seem to intensify as families lit their hearth fires for the evening, creating a thickening haze that would, on certain nights when atmospheric conditions were just right, transform into the infamous London fog, those pea-soupers that could reduce visibility to mere feet and turn the act of walking from one street corner to the next into an adventure worthy of epic poetry. But even on clear nights, the air carried its particular blend of scents, the smoke, yes, but also the sweet corruption of horse manure that covered the streets, the occasional whiff of the Thames when the wind was from the east, the smell of cooking from the open windows of tenements, and underneath it all, a damp, earthy odour that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves, as twilight deepened into true night, around 6 or 7 o'clock, depending on the season. The character of the city would shift once more. The family homes would close in upon themselves, doors locked, curtains drawn, the outside world shut out as much as was possible. But the city itself did not sleep. Indeed, for many, the night was just beginning, as we shall see. The night economy, while respectable Londoners settled into their homes for the evening, a different city was emerging onto the streets, a nocturnal economy that thrived in the hours between dusk and dawn. This was the London of the night workers, those who made their living while others slept, who found in the darkness both opportunity and necessity. To walk the streets of Victorian London after dark was to encounter a cast of characters who would have seemed strange and somewhat troubling to those who knew the city only by day. The night watchmen, the coffee stall keepers, the cab drivers on the evening shift, the street sellers who catered to those whose appetites or needs would not wait for morning. Perhaps no figure was more emblematic of Victorian London's night economy than the coffee stall keeper. These enterprising souls appeared on street corners and at the edges of markets as darkness fell, materializing as if summoned by the night itself. Their stalls ranging from simple boards laid across sawhorses to elaborate affairs, resembling something between a gypsy tent and a watchman's box. The coffee stall keeper would arrive at his spot carrying the tools of his trade balanced on a yoke across his shoulders, the great bright tin cans with their brass taps, already filled with hot coffee or tea, kept warm by small charcoal fires burning underneath in what were called The preparation for opening would be quick but methodical, benches set up, if he had them, perhaps a canvas tent erected to provide some shelter from the wind, a lamp lit and positioned to cast its feeble glow over the stall's offerings. The menu at a coffee stall was simple but sufficient for its clientele. A cup of coffee and 2 thin pieces of bread and butter, referred to as too thin, could be had for a penny in the West End and City, or for half that around the docks where the customers were entirely of the working class. Some stalls also offered tea and cocoa, keeping hot milk in one of the cans for those who wanted it. The more ambitious proprietors might have ham sandwiches or slices of cake displayed on boards with compartments, though these were relative luxuries. The coffee itself was strong and hot, and that was what mattered. In the biting cold of a London winter night, the warmth of the cup in one's hands was as valuable as the liquid inside, and the coffee stall keeper knew this. Understanding that he was selling comfort as much as refreshment, the timing of when these stalls appeared depended on their intended clientele. Some would set up shop as early as midnight, catering to what were euphemistically called night walkers, fast gentlemen and loose women, those who prowled the streets in search of entertainment or companionship or business of a kind that was best conducted under the cover of darkness. It was, as observers noted, piteous to see young girls, some still bearing the appearance of innocence not yet completely corrupted, clustering together for warmth around a coffee stall, admitted by the penny expenditure or sometimes by the charity of the proprietor, seeking what little comfort could be found in a hot cup and a moment's respite from the cold and the predatory attention of the men who also frequented such places. Other stalls did not appear until 3 or 4 in the morning, positioning themselves to catch the early morning trade, the costermongers and street sellers heading to the markets to secure their supplies for the day, the workers beginning the first shift at the docks or in the factories, the night shift ending and making their way home. The best locations for these early morning stalls were well known and hotly contested: the Strand, Oxford Street, City Road, the New Road from one end to the other, and of course near the great markets of Covent Garden, Billingsgate and Newgate. On market mornings, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, seats at a well-placed stall might be half again as much as on other days. The coffee stall served a social function beyond merely providing refreshment. In the hours before dawn, when the streets were at their coldest and most inhospitable, the warm glow of the stall's lamp and the presence of the stall-keeper provided a kind of anchor point, a place of minimal human contact and conversation in the vast darkness of the sleeping city. Workers would pause there, warming themselves, exchanging a few words with the proprietor or with each other, gathering energy for the day ahead. The stall-keeper would hear all manner of stories, witness all sorts of human drama played out in miniature around his makeshift establishment, the desperation of those who had been out all night without earning a penny, the cautious optimism of those heading to try their luck at the dock gates, the exhausted relief of night workers finally released from their labours. The economics of running a coffee stall were precarious at best. One stall-keeper interviewed in the late 1850s reported that he usually cleared about 14 or 15 shillings per week, including Sundays, though this was when business was good. On wet and cold nights when few people were about, he might not earn sixpence for being out all night. The overhead was not insignificant. The coffee, tea, cocoa, milk, sugar, bread, butter, all had to be purchased. The charcoal for heating the cans cost money, and if the stall-keeper did not own his equipment outright, he might have to rent it. The trade was, by all accounts, overcrowded by the 1880s, with too many stalls chasing too few customers, what they themselves described as 2 of us eating one man's bread. Yet still they came out night after night, because for many, this was the only way they knew to make a living, however meek, working alongside the coffee stall keepers in maintaining London's nocturnal economy were the cab drivers of the night shift. The distinction between day and night cabmen was not merely one of timing, but of experience and often of circumstance. The night trade was considered somewhat less desirable. The hours were long. The fares could be fewer and farther between, and there was always the risk of dealing with drunken passengers who might become troublesome or worse, violent. Yet the night cabmen were there, at their stands outside the railway stations and the West End theatres, waiting for the custom that would come. The life of a cab driver, whether day or night, was a hard one. They worked 12-hour shifts and had to pay for the hire of their vehicles and horses out of the fares they earned. A hansom cab driver needed to earn 14 or 16 shillings a day in summer for his owner, in addition to what was called yard money, the charges for the stables where the horse was kept and the cab stored. Out of this, the driver had to extract enough to feed himself and pay for his lodging. The arithmetic was rarely favourable. The best stands were those where custom was most predictably outside, the great terminus stations like Paddington and King's Cross, where trains arrived at all hours disgorging passengers in need of transport, or in the theatre district, where the nightly performances would end around 11 o'clock, and suddenly dozens of well-dressed patrons would emerge onto the street, many of them willing to pay for the convenience and speed of a hansom cab. The hansom cab itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, designed for speed and maneuverability through London's crowded streets, with its low-slung carriage suspended between two large wheels, its driver's seat perched high at the back behind the passenger compartment. It could carry 2 people in relative comfort, though 3 could squeeze in if necessary. The design was such that the driver sat above and behind his passengers, the reins running over the roof of the cab, allowing him to control the horse while having a clear view of the street ahead. Communication between driver and passengers was through a small trapdoor in the roof, through which instructions could be given and, eventually, payment handed up. The licensed hansom cabs of London, by the 1880s, were required to meet certain standards. They were painted in specific colours, often a green. Undercarriage with black upper panels, and carried their licence numbers prominently displayed. Inside, the passenger compartment would be upholstered in leather or wool cloth, with the better cabs having small touches of luxury like brass fittings and communication whistles. The cabs were supposed to be weatherproof, with folding wooden doors that could be closed to protect the passengers' legs and feet from mud and rain, and retractable front windows, though in practice many cabs were in various states of disrepair, their doors not quite closing, their windows stuck open or shut, their seats feeling as if stuffed with broken stones rather than proper padding. Travelling in a hansom cab at night was an experience unlike anything we might know today. The ride was bumpy, the springs of the cab creaking and groaning with every irregularity in the cobblestones. The horses' hooves created a steady rhythm, sometimes quickening to a trot when the street was clear, sometimes slowing to a walk when traffic was heavy or the driver needed to navigate a particularly tricky bit of roadway. Through the windows, if they were open, or through the slight gaps in the doors, if they were closed, would come the sounds and smells of the nighttime city, the call of other cab drivers, the distant sound of music from a public house, the ever-present aroma of smoke and horse and humanity pressed together in insufficient space. The gas lamps would stream past, each pool of light briefly illuminating the cab's interior before darkness returned, creating a rhythmic pattern of light and shadow that could be almost hypnotic. For ladies travelling alone at night in a hansom there were particular concerns. The rains that ran over the roof of the cab could catch on elaborate hats, knocking them askew or even off entirely. The wheels, positioned right at the entrance to the cab, posed a hazard for long skirts and the voluminous crinolines that had been popular earlier in the era. And there was always the question of propriety. A woman in a cab at night was, by some measures of Victorian morality, somewhat suspect unless she was clearly of the upper classes and likely travelling to or from some respectable social engagement. The cab drivers themselves were a mixed lot. Some honest working men trying to make a living, others rather less scrupulous, known to take advantage of passengers who didn't know the proper fare or who were in no condition to argue about being overcharged. Between the coffee stalls and the cab stands, between the scattered pools of gaslight and the stretches of relative darkness, moved another class of night workers, the patrolling figures of the night watchman, though by the 1880s the modern police force established by Sir Robert Peel had largely superseded the old system of night watchers. There were still watchmen employed by private businesses, by wealthy neighbourhoods, and by certain institutions to keep an eye on property and deter crime during the hours of darkness. These men, often elderly, sometimes war veterans or those who had failed at other occupations, would patrol their assigned territories through the night, from 9 or 10 in the evening until sunrise, their presence both reassuring and slightly eerie. The night watchman's equipment was simple but distinctive. He carried a lantern to light his way and to signal his presencer, moving light in the darkness that might give pause to anyone with criminal intent. He had a wooden rattle, a noisemaker that could be spun rapidly to create a harsh, alarming clatter that would summon help or alert others to danger. And he had, usually, a stout truncheon or cudgel, though these were more for show and deterrence than for actual combat. As most watchmen were neither young nor physically imposing enough to handle a real confrontation with determined criminals, the watchman's role was more about being seen and heard, about creating the impression of surveillance and potential consequence, than about actual physical intervention. The calling of the hours was a traditional duty of night watchmen, though by the 1880s this practice was fading. In earlier times, a watchman would call out each hour as it struck, letting the sleeping city know that all was well, or in case of fire or other emergency, raising the alarm. The cry would be simple and ritualistic, past 12 o'clock and all's well, or some variation thereof. The sound of this call echoing through the empty streets would have been both comforting in its assurance of protection and unsettling, in the way it emphasized just how quiet and deserted those streets were at the deepest hours of night. By the late Victorian period, this calling had mostly ceased in London proper, though it continued in some smaller towns and in the imaginations of those who remembered or read about the old ways. The night economy extended beyond these more visible figures to include a whole host of people whose work kept them out during the hours when most slept. There were the drivers of the night soil carts, who collected the human waste from the cesspits and privies that still existed in areas not yet connected to the modern sewer system, performing this noisome but necessary labor under cover of darkness when the streets were clearer and the number of witnesses to this distasteful necessity was minimized. There were the early morning milk deliverers, who would be out by 4 or 5 o'clock, their carts filled with large metal cans of milk, stopping at houses to ladle out the amount needed into the customer's jug. There were the newspaper boys, though they didn't fully mobilize until closer to dawn when the morning editions were ready for distribution, and there were those whose presence in the night streets was less a matter of choice than of circumstance, the homeless, the destitute, those who had nowhere else to go and who would walk the streets all night rather than pay the few pence required for a bed in a common lodging house, or who had already been turned out of such a place for lack of payment. These were the true noctivagants, the night wanderers who occupied a liminal space in Victorian society, neither fully criminal nor fully respectable, simply surplus humanity that the city's economic engine had ground up and spat out. On cold nights they might cluster around the coffee stalls, if the proprietor was charitable enough to let them, or they might find some sheltered doorway or alley where they could huddle until dawn brought with it the possibility, however slim, of earning enough to eat and perhaps secure shelter for the following night. The domestic night while the streets held their population of night workers and wanderers. Behind the closed doors and drawn curtains of London's homes, another kind of night was unfolding, the domestic evening, when families gathered together in their parlors and sitting rooms, when the day's work was set aside and a few hours of rest and respite were claimed before sleep. The nature of this domestic night varied dramatically based on social class and economic circumstance. From the palatial houses of Mayfair, where gas chandeliers blazed in drawing rooms filled with elegant company, to the single-room tenements of the East End, where families crowded around a meagre fire, to the modest, middle-class homes of Bloomsbury and Kensington, where respectability and comfort existed in careful balance. In a middle-class household of the 1880s, the evening would follow a certain pattern that had been established by decades of Victorian domestic ritual. The master of the house would return home from his office or place of business sometime between 6 and 7 o'clock, hanging his coat and hat in the hall, perhaps stopping to wash his hands and face in the basin that would be waiting for him. The evening meal, called dinner or supper depending on the household's precise social standing, would be taken in the dining room, with the family gathered around the table under the light of a gas pendant, or, in homes not yet connected to the gas system, an oil lamp or candles arranged in calibers. The dining room itself would be a rather dark space by our modern standards. The gaslight, even if there were multiple jets, provided only modest illumination, sufficient to see one's food and the faces of one's companions, but not to fully banish the shadows from the corners of the room. The walls, typically painted in the dark colours favoured by Victorian tastes, deep reds, rich greens, sombre browns, absorbed rather than reflected what light there was, creating an atmosphere that was intimate but also somewhat cave-like, enclosed and protected from the outside world. The table would be set with the family's best china and silverware, or at least the best they could afford, for the evening meal was an important ritual, a marker of the family's status and the wife's competence as a household manager. The meal itself would be substantial but not elaborate unless guests were present. A typical middle-class dinner might consist of soup, followed by a joint of meat, beef, mutton, or pork with vegetables and potatoes, and concluded with a pudding or some other form of dessert. The food would be brought from the kitchen by a maid if the family could afford one, or by the wife herself if not. Conversation during the meal was expected to be pleasant but not frivolous, with the father perhaps holding forth on events of the day, business matters deemed suitable for family discussion, or opinions on political developments. The children, if present, were expected to be seen and not heard, to eat properly and maintain good posture, to embody the Victorian ideal of disciplined behaviour that would prepare them for their eventual roles as adults in this rigidly ordered society. After the meal, the family would retire to the parlor or sitting room, the room that was the heart of the Victorian home, the space where family life was lived and guests were received. This room would be furnished with care, every item chosen to reflect the family's taste and means. There would be a sofa, probably upholstered in horsehair, covered with fabric, stiff and uncomfortable by modern standards, but considered appropriate for the time. There would be chairs of various sorts, armchairs for the adults, straight-backed chairs for others, perhaps a rocking chair near the fire. There would be tables, a centre table, often circular or square, positioned prominently, side tables and lamp tables scattered about, perhaps a fire screen to protect delicate complexions from the direct heat of the flames. The fireplace would be the focal point of the room, and indeed of the entire domestic evening. In Victorian England, even in homes with central heating, which was beginning to be installed in some wealthier households, the open coal fire remained essential. There was something almost ritualistic about the fire, something that spoke to deep human needs for warmth and light and the comfort of flames. The fire would have been laid during the day by the maid, if there was one, or by whoever had the responsibility for such tasks, carefully arranged in the grate. Perhaps some kindling or paper to help it catch. The whole structure designed to burn efficiently and provide maximum heat with minimum waste. Tending the fire was an ongoing task throughout the evening. It needed to be fed regularly to keep it burning bright, but not so much that fuel was wasted. The ashes had to be managed, the smoke drawn properly up the chimney. The fireplace, tools, poker, tongs, shovel would be arranged nearby, usually on a stand, their brass or iron surfaces polished to a shine as a matter of household pride. On the mantelpiece above the fire would be arranged various decorative items. A clock, certainly, for timekeeping was important to the well-ordered Victorian household. Perhaps some porcelain figures or vases, family photographs in their elaborate frames, candlesticks, even if gas lighting was available. 4 candles retained their aesthetic appeal and their association with occasions of ceremony and importance. The light in the parlor would come from multiple sources, creating a complex landscape of illumination and shadow. If the house had gas, there would be a pendant fixture hanging from the center of the ceiling, perhaps with 2 or 3 burners and wall brackets on either side of the room, creating a general ambient light. But gas lighting, even at its best, had significant limitations. It was not particularly bright. It consumed oxygen from the room. Requiring good ventilation, it produced heat, adding to whatever warmth came from the fire, and it had a tendency to make colors appear different than they did in daylight, shifting blues toward green and reds toward orange, in ways that could be disconcerting. For close work, needlework, writing, additional light was needed, and this typically came from oil lamps or candles placed on the tables near where people sat. These portable sources of light could be positioned as needed, brought near when detailed work required it, moved away when it was done. The oil lamps of the 1880s were sophisticated devices, descendants of the Agan lamp invented in the late 18th century, with their circular wicks and glass chimneys designed to improve the brightness and steadiness of the flame. Even so, reading by lamplight was tiring for the eyes, and there is evidence that the prevalence of myopia increased during the Victorian period, possibly due to the strain of working in insufficient light. The activities that filled the evening hours in a middle-class Victorian home were varied but centered around the cultivation of domestic virtues and accomplishments. Reading was paramount. The father might have his newspaper or a book, perhaps something improving and educational, while the mother and daughters would share periodicals, novels, or religious texts. The Victorian era was the great age of the novel, and reading aloud was a common family entertainment, with family members taking turns to read passages from Dickens or Thackeray, Scott or Eliot, the sound of the reader's voice filling the room while the others occupied themselves with handwork or simply listened. Needlework was a constant occupation for Victorian women and girls. By the light of lamp or candle, they would sew, embroider, knit, or crochet, creating items, both practical and decorative clothes, and linens for the household. Antimacassars, to protect the furniture from hair oil. Doilies and table covers, samplers and decorative panels. The skill demonstrated in needlework was considered an important mark of feminine accomplishment, and hours upon hours were devoted to its practice. The parlor would be littered with the paraphernalia of this work baskets filled with thread and needles, partially completed projects draped over chair arms, the small scissors and other tools of the seamstress's trade. Music was another important element of the domestic evening, particularly in homes that could afford a piano. The The piano stood in the parlor like an altar to culture and refinement, and the daughters of the house would be expected to have received lessons and to be able to perform for family and guests. The repertoire would include popular songs of the day, arrangements of classical pieces simplified for the amateur performer, hymns, and other religious music. The sound of the piano, combined with the singing of the performer or of the family gathered around, would fill the house audible to neighbors if the windows were open, a sign of the musical cultivation that was so valued in Victorian society. The quality of these performances varied wildly, of course, from genuinely accomplished to painful to endure, but the important thing was the participation, the demonstration of proper accomplishment and taste. Conversation, too, was cultivated as an art. The topics deemed appropriate for family discussion were carefully bounded by propriety. Politics might be discussed, at least in general terms, though heated debate was considered unjust. Literature and art were safe subjects, as were observations about people one knew, though gossip had to be managed carefully to avoid crossing the line into uncharitable territory. Business matters might be mentioned but not dwelt upon in mixed company. Anything touching on sexuality or bodily functions was absolutely forbidden, creating a peculiar blindness in Victorian discourse, an inability to name or discuss vast areas of human experience. As the evening progressed toward bedtime, there would be a final gathering, often in the dining room, for a light supper, perhaps bread and cheese, cold meat, tea or coffee. This was a more relaxed meal than dinner, less formal, a chance to satisfy any hunger that had arisen since the earlier meal and to mark the transition toward sleep. Afterward, preparations for bed would begin. In homes without running water, this meant carrying up jugs of hot water heated on the kitchen fire, filling the basin in each bedroom for washing. The fires in the bedrooms, if they were lit at all, would have been started earlier in the evening, though many Victorian homes did not heat the bedrooms, preferring to keep them cold on the theory that cold air was healthier for sleeping. The journey from the warmth of the parlor to the cold of an unheated bedroom was a transition that Victorian children remembered into their old age. The shock of leaving the firelit sitting room and climbing the stairs into increasingly chilly air, then entering a bedroom where one's breath might be visible on particularly cold nights. Nightclothes were donned quickly, long flannel nightgowns or nightshirts that covered the body from neck to ankle, and sometimes a nightcap as well to conserve body heat. The bed itself would have been warmed if the household ran to such comforts, with a warming pan filled with hot coals and run between the sheets, or with a hot water bottler, ceramic or metal container filled with hot water and wrapped in cloth. Before sleep, there would be prayers. Victorian piety demanded that each day be bookended with devotions, and the family would kneel beside their beds to say their prayers, thanking God for the day's blessings, asking for forgiveness for any failings, requesting protection through the night. In some households, the entire family would gather in one room for evening prayers, with the father reading from the Bible and leading the devotions. This was considered an important duty of the Christian household, a way of maintaining moral order and connection to the divine. And then, finally, the lamps and candles would be extinguished. The house would settle into darkness, broken only by the glow of dying fires in the grates, and London would wrap itself in sleep, or at least the portion of London that had the luxury of sleeping would do so. For many, the night meant something quite different. In the working-class homes of the East End, the domestic evening was a far simpler and grimmer affair. Families might live in a single room, or two at most, the entire household sharing the same space for all activities. There would be no separate parlor, no dining room, no privacy to speak of. The room would serve as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once, with perhaps a curtain rigged to provide some minimal separation of functions. The furniture would be sparser bed, perhaps too, if the family was large, a table and some chairs or stools, a few shelves or a cupboard for the small amount of possessions the family owned. Light in such rooms came from candles, the cheapest tallow dips that filled the air with their stinking smoke, or from small oil lamps if the family could afford the oil. The fire, burning in a grate that was often inadequate for the size of the room, would provide some illumination along with its warmth, though coal was expensive and had to be used sparingly. On the coldest nights, the entire family might huddle near the fire, wrapped in whatever blankets or shawls they possessed, trying to stay warm until it was time to retreat to bed, which might mean simply spreading pallets on the floor or cramming multiple people into a single bed. Body heat helping to ward off the cold that seeped through the thin walls and uninsulated roof. Food in these households was simple and often insufficient. A meal might consist of bread, perhaps with a scraping of butter or drippings, some tea if there was tea to be had. On good days there might be a bit of meat, some potatoes, perhaps vegetables if they were in season and cheap. But for many working-class families, hunger was a constant companion, and the evening meal was less a time of satisfaction than a reminder of inadequacy, of the struggle to provide for one's family, of the precariousness of existence on the edge of destitution. The evening hours in such households were not filled with reading and music and refined conversation. They were filled with the work that never ended: women mending clothes by inadequate light, trying to extend the life of garments that were already threadbare. Men, perhaps, working on some piecework brought home from the factory or workshop, earning a few extra pence. Children watching with the peculiar watchfulness of those who have learned early that life is hard and uncertain. There might be some small recreations, a game of cards if someone had a pack, stories told around the fire, songs sung if anyone had the heart for singing. But mostly there was exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness that comes from physical labor and insufficient food, from sleeping in cold, damp rooms, from the constant stress of poverty. And yet, even in these circumstances, even in the darkest corners of London's East End, there was humanity, there was family. There was the determination to endure and perhaps, some day, to rise to something better. The domestic night, whether in Mayfair or Whitechapel, was when London's people turned inward, when they sought whatever comfort and security their circumstances allowed, when they tried to create something like home in a city that could be both nurturing and cruel, generous and indifferent, often in the same moment. The river and the fog. If there was one element that defined Victorian London's nights more than any other, it was the fog, the thick, yellow-brown, sulphurous blanket that could descend upon the city with little warning, transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes, muffling sound, obscuring vision, creating a world that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. The Londoners called it many things: the pea-souper for its resemblance to thick pea soup, the London particular, a term borrowed from the name of a brown Madeira wine, the black fog when it was at its absolute worst. By whatever name, it was both the city's curse and, strangely, part of its identity, so much so that even after it had been banished by clean air legislation in the mid-20th century, tourists would arrive expecting to find fog, disappointed to discover clear air instead. The fog's source was no mystery. at least not to those who understood atmospheric science. London sat in the Thames basin, surrounded by hills that could trap air masses and prevent their dispersion. The Thames itself, that great serpentine river that had given birth to the city and sustained it for millennia, contributed its own moisture to the atmosphere. When a natural fog formed fogs will form in any damp river valley, when the right conditions of temperature and humidity existed, would mix with the smoke from a million coal fires, the emissions from factories and gasworks, the general atmospheric pollution that was the inevitable byproduct of being the world's largest industrial city. The result was not just fog, but smog. Though that word would not be coined until 1905, it was a toxic mixture of water vapor, coal, smoke, sulfurous acid, soot particles, and various other chemical compounds, creating a substance that was as harmful as it was dramatic. The fogs were worst in winter, when more coal was being burned for heating, when the temperature inversions that trapped the polluted air near the ground were most common. They could occur in any month, but November through February was the true fog season, when Londoners would wake to find that the world outside their windows had disappeared into a brown-yellow murk, when visibility might be reduced to a few feet, when the simple act of walking from one's home to the nearest shop became an adventure requiring courage and skill. On such days, business would slow or stop entirely, as the impossibility of seeing made commerce difficult, if not impossible. Schools would close. The omnibuses would cease running, their drivers unable to see where they were going. Even the hansom cab drivers, those intrepid navigators of London's streets, would hesitate to venture out into the worst of the fog. The fog had a physical presence that is difficult to convey to those who have never experienced it. It was not simply an absence of visibility, but an actual substance that one moved through, that pressed against the skin, that filled the lungs with each breath, irritating, leaving a taste of sulfur and coal on the tongue. It stained everything it touched. White collars would turn grey within hours. The particulates in the fog would settle on surfaces, leaving a greasy film that required constant cleaning. Inside buildings, the fog would seep through every crack and gap, dimming the lights, filling rooms with a haze that made even indoor spaces feel oppressive and enclosed. The sensory experience of being out in a London fog was uncanny and disorienting. Sight, of course, was the sense most affected. In a moderate fog, one might be able to see a few yards ahead, enough to navigate by the shapes of buildings and the glow of street lamps, though these appeared only as diffuse halos of yellowish light, their sources invisible until one was almost upon them. In a heavy fog, what the Victorians called a black fog, when the soot content was particularly high, visibility might drop to mere feet or even inches. There are accounts of people walking with arms outstretched, feeling their way along building fronts, unable to see their own feet. The ground beneath them only a matter of faith rather than vision. Sound behaved strangely in the fog. Some sounds seemed muffled and distant, as if coming from underwater, while others would suddenly ring out with startling clarity, apparently close, but coming from sources that remained invisible. The clip-clop of horse hooves might seem to be right beside you, only for the horse to materialize out of the murk coming from an entirely different direction. The sound of voices, of footsteps, of the various noises of the city, all became dislocated and unreliable. This acoustic confusion added to the sense of disorientation and could make navigation even more difficult, as one could not rely on sound to supplement the loss of vision. The dangers of the fog were real and manifold. People could and did lose their way completely, wandering for hours trying to find familiar landmarks, sometimes ending up miles from where they intended to be. Falls and accidents were common, walking into lampposts, stumbling over curbs, colliding with other pedestrians. The Thames claimed victims on foggy days, unfortunate souls who strayed too close to the unprotected river's edge and tumbled into the cold, dark water, their cries for help muffled by the fog or going unheard because there was no one near enough to help. The fog also provided perfect cover for crime. Thieves operated with impunity when visibility was measured in feet, able to rob pedestrians and then disappear into the murk before help could arrive or pursuit be organized. The health effects of the fog were even more serious, though they were not fully understood at the time. The combination of cold, damp air and toxic pollutants was devastating to those with respiratory conditions. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and other lung diseases were endemic in London, particularly in the winter months when the fogs were frequent. There are records of fog deaths, mortality rates that spiked dramatically during and immediately after severe fogs, as the elderly, the very young, and those with compromised respiratory systems succumbed to the assault on their lungs. One fog in 1873 was estimated to have caused 268 deaths from bronchitis alone. Another in 1879 lasted from November to March, for long months during which the sun barely appeared, an extended twilight that must have felt like the world was ending. Yet for all its dangers and discomforts, the fog became, in the Victorian imagination, strangely beautiful and romantic. Writers and artists found in it an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Charles Dickens, more than any other, made the London fog famous. His descriptions of it in novels like Bleak House entering into the language as defining images of Victorian London. Other writers followed his lead. Louis Stevenson used fog to create atmosphere in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Conan Doyle sent Sherlock Holmes out into the fog in countless adventures. Henry James, Joseph Conrad, and many others used the fog as both setting and symbol, a representation of mystery, danger, moral ambiguity, and the unknowable nature of modern urban life. The Thames itself, which had given rise to the fog through its contribution of moisture to the atmosphere, took on a different character at night, especially on those nights when the fog rolled in thick and heavy. During the day, the river was a highway of commerce, crowded with vessels of every description, great sailing ships, steamers, barges, wherries, tugs, all moving up and down with the tide, carrying the goods that made London the commercial capital of the world. The docks that lined the river, the London docks, the West India docks, the Surrey commercial docks, and all the others were hives of activity, with thousands of workers loading and unloading cargo. The smells of tobacco and coffee, rum and timber, spices and wool, all mixing together in the river air. But at night, the river took on a different aspect. The daytime bustle would die down. Though some activity continued through the night hours, the docks never completely slept. The warehouses that lined the river's edge, those massive brick structures 5 or 6 stories high with their rows of small windows, would loom up out of the darkness like fortresses, their silhouettes barely visible against the slightly lighter sky. The ships moored in the river would show only their riding lights, small points of illumination that marked their positions but did nothing to reveal their forms. The bridges that spanned the River Waterloo, Blackfriars, London Bridge, Tower Bridge, after its completion in 1894, would be marked by gas lights along their spans, strings of small lights stretching across the dark void of the river, reflected in the water below when the water was calm enough to hold reflections. Walking along the Thames embankment at night was an experience that many found both thrilling and unsettling. The Victoria Embankment on the north side, opened in 1870, was one of the city's proudest achievements. A broad promenade with gardens, roadways for traffic, and a thoroughfare for the underground railway beneath. It had been lit first with gas lamps, and then, as early as 1878, with electric lights, making it the first street in Britain to be electrically illuminated, though the experiment was not immediately sustained in gas, returned until 1901, when electricity was permanently established. To walk along the embankment on a clear night, with the lights reflected in the river, the city stretching out on either side, was to feel oneself at the centre of the modern world, part of something vast and important and new. But on a foggy night, the embankment became something else entirely. The lights would be reduced to mere suggestions, glowing orbs floating in the mud. The solid stone wall that prevented pedestrians from falling into the river would disappear into the fog just a few feet from the path, and one would have to trust that it was there, that the edge of the land had not somehow shifted, that one would not suddenly step into empty air and fall into the cold water below. The sounds of the river would change. In the fog, the lapping of water against the embankment wall would seem louder, more immediate, while the sounds of boat traffic would become disembodied and strange. The deep throb of a steamship's engine, or the call of a waterman echoing through the fog. From no discernible direction, the fog affected the docks and the river trade in particular ways. When the fog was thick enough, river traffic would simply stop. Ships remaining at anchor or moored to the docks, waiting for visibility to improve. This could cause significant delays and economic disruption, as cargoes that needed to be unloaded or ships that needed to sail sat idle. The dock workers who depended on the daily colon for their employment would find there was no work on foggy days, no ships coming in, no need for their labour. For them, a fog day was a day without wages. Another small crisis in the precarious economy of their lives. The fog also brought out a strange poetry in observers. Looking at London from a height on a foggy night, one could see how the fog settled into the valleys and depressions of the urban landscape, how it flowed like a liquid into low-lying areas, how it could create layers, with clear air above and fog below, or with fog at ground level and a layer of clear air between, then more fog above, from a balloon. And there were those in the Victorian era who went up in balloons specifically to observe the city from above. London at night appeared as a vast field of lights, the gas lamps creating a glowing web that traced out the streets and squares, the river appearing as a dark serpentine void through the middle, crossed by the illuminated threads of the bridges, the fog, the river, the darkness, the lights struggling against it. All of these combined to create an atmosphere that was uniquely London, uniquely Victorian, something that could not be replicated anywhere else or in any other time. It was a city of contrasts and contradictions, of modern marvels and ancient squalor, of gaslight and shadow, of the constant presence of human activity and the equally constant presence of spaces that seemed abandoned and threatening. To walk through London at night in the 1880s was to experience all of this, to feel simultaneously connected to the greatest metropolis on earth and utterly alone in the darkness. The late-night silences, midnight passed, and the city moved into the deepest hours of the night. A different kind of quiet would descend upon London, Not the complete silence of a rural night, but rather an urban hush, a diminishment of the constant background noise that characterized the daytime and evening hours. This was the time when the city came as close to sleeping as it ever would, when the last theatre-goers had made their way home, when the public houses had closed their doors, when even the most determined revellers had finally sought their beds. The streets did not become completely empty. London was too large, too active, too inhabited for that, but they became emptier, and the sense of solitude and isolation that one could feel while walking them at this hour was profound. The lamp, having completed their evening rounds many hours before, would not return until near dawn to extinguish the gas lamps, so the streets remained lit throughout the night, those pools of yellow light continuing to mark out the major thoroughfares and squares, but with fewer people about, with less movement and activity. The lights seemed almost like stage props, illuminating scenes where the actors had departed, marking spaces that had temporarily lost their purpose. The shadows between the lamps seemed to grow deeper and more substantial, as if the darkness was asserting itself more strongly now that fewer humans were present to push back against it. The sounds of the late-night city were sparse but distinct. The clip-clop of a late hansom cab, carrying home some wealthy night owl, or hurrying to answer a call from a railway station where a late train had arrived. The footsteps of a solitary walker, their echoes off the building fronts, making it seem as if there were 2 or 3 people rather than one, the sound carrying far in the still air, the distant bark of a dog, the call of a night watchman, though by this hour most watchmen would have found some corner or doorway where they could sit and rest while ostensibly remaining on duty. Perhaps, very faintly, the sound of the river, that constant presence in London's consciousness, the lapping of water against stone, the creak of a moored ship moving with the tide. This was the hour when those who could not sleep might venture to their windows and look out onto the empty streets below. Insomnia was as much a Victorian complaint as it is a modern one, and there were many whose thoughts or worries or physical discomforts kept them wakeful through these late hours. What they would see from their windows would depend greatly on where in London they were. In a wealthy neighbourhood, the street might be completely empty, not a soul visible. The only movement, the slight sway of tree branches, if there were trees, or perhaps a cat stalking along in search of mice. In a working-class district, there might still be figures, visible, someone coming home from a late shift at a factory, a woman hurrying to or from some errand, though what legitimate errand could require her to be out at this hour was questionable. In the areas around the docks, there would always be some activity, the docks themselves never truly closing, ships arriving or departing on the tide regardless of the hour. The police constables, the bobbies who had replaced the old night watch system, would be making their rounds, walking their beats with the measured tread of men who had hours yet to go before their shift ended. The police presence in Victorian London was relatively thin by modern standards. There were never enough constables to properly patrol all the streets, especially in the poorer areas where crime was most prevalent. A constable might walk the same circuit repeatedly throughout his shift, checking doorways and windows, rattling gates to ensure they were properly locked, watching for anything suspicious or out of place. The constable's lantern, a bullseye design that could direct its beam in a specific direction, would create a moving pool of light as he walked, illuminating briefly each section of street before moving on, leaving it to darkness again. The uniform, the distinctive helmet, the blue serge coat with its brass buttons, the wooden truncheon hanging from his belt marked him unmistakably as a representative of the law. His presence was meant to be both reassuring to the law-abiding and deterring to those who might contemplate criminal activity. But in truth, the constable was often as vulnerable as anyone else in the dark streets, and attacks on police officers, though taken very seriously by the authorities, were not uncommon in the rougher districts for the homeless and destitute. These late-night hours were the most difficult. The cold would seep into bones, no matter how many layers of ragged clothing one wore, no matter how many newspapers one stuffed inside one's coat for insulation. The London winters, while not as brutally cold as those in more northern climates, had a particular penetrating dampness that made the cold feel worse than the thermometer reading would suggest. To be without shelter on a February night in London, when the temperature hovered just above freezing and a thin rain fell constantly from invisible clouds, soaking everything, was to be truly miserable. Some would walk the streets all night, simply to keep moving, to generate body heat through activity. Though this required energy that hunger had already depleted, the workhouses, those grim institutions that Charles Dickens had immortalized and critiqued, would take in the destitute, but only on certain terms. One had to present oneself during specific hours, had to undergo a degree of humiliation and questioning, had to accept the separation of family members who were sent to different wards, had to agree to perform labor in exchange for the meager accommodations provided. For many, especially those who still possessed some shred of pride or who feared the workhouse system's harshness, sleeping rough seemed preferable, despite its obvious hardships. They would find whatever shelter they could, a doorway recessed enough to provide some protection from wind and rain, an alley where the buildings blocked the worst of the weather, the arches under railway bridges where at least the roof overhead kept off the rain even if it did nothing to stop the cold, the churches and charitable institutions that opened their doors to provide shelter, for the homeless would do so only in the evening, and those who arrived too late or who for whatever reason could not secure a place would be turned away to fend for themselves through the night. There were soup kitchens and missions that provided food, but again these operated on schedules and their resources were always insufficient to meet the need. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865 as the East London Christian Mission and renamed in 1878, was actively working to provide aid to the destitute, but their resources too were limited, their facilities overcrowded, their ability to help constrained by the sheer scale of poverty in Victorian London. In the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, London reached its quietest point. This was when the fewest people were awake, when even the night workers had mostly completed their tasks or found moments to rest, when the city seemed to hold its breath in the darkness. If one stood on a high point, perhaps on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, that great domed edifice that dominated the city's skyline, and looked out over London at this hour, what would one see? The gas lamps would still burn, their collective glow creating a kind of luminous haze over the city, but there would be little movement visible, few signs of the teeming life that would return with the dawn. The sky above, if the night was clear, would show the stars, though never as brightly as they appeared in the countryside, the city's lights and atmospheric pollution dimming even the celestial luminaries. The moon, if it was visible, would appear strange through London's atmosphere, sometimes taking on an orange or reddish hue from the particulates in the air. In the distance, perhaps, the flare of an industrial furnace might be visible, or the lights of ships on the Thames, or the glowing windows of a hospital where the work of healing continued around the clock. But mostly, there would be an impression of vastness and darkness, of a city that in daylight seemed so completely mapped and known, now revealing itself as something more mysterious, less comprehensible. London by day was a place of commerce and industry, of rational organization and purposeful activity. London by night, especially in these deepest hours, was something else, a place of shadows and ambiguity, where the certainties of daylight seemed to dissolve, where the social hierarchies and categories that governed life seemed less fixed and more permeable. The darkness was a leveler in its way, making everyone rich or poor, powerful or weak, equally vulnerable to the perils of the night. The temperature would drop to its lowest point just before dawn, that coldest hour when the night had lasted longest and the sun's warming influence was still hours away. Frost might form on exposed surfaces, even in the city where the warmth from buildings and the heat retained by stone and brick moderated the temperature. The first stirrings of the new day would begin around 4 or 5 o'clock, depending on the season. The very earliest workers, the market porters, the bakers who needed to have bread ready for the morning trade, the milkmen beginning their rounds would start to appear on the streets. The coffee stall keepers, if they had closed at all during the middle of the night, would begin to reopen, positioning themselves to catch the early morning trade. The costermongers and street sellers would be making their way to Covent Garden or Billingsgate or the other markets, hoping to secure the best produce or fish or flowers before the competition arrived. The lamplighters would begin their morning rounds, moving through the streets to extinguish the gas lamps now that daylight was approaching. Though on particularly foggy mornings, the lamps might be left burning through the day, their light needed even during nominal daylight hours. The domestic servants in wealthy households would be rising from their narrow beds in the attics or basement quarters, beginning the work of preparing the house for the daylighting fires in the various rooms, heating water for washing, preparing breakfast, cleaning and tidying before the family woke. Their work was invisible to those they served, happening in the early morning hours, so that when the master and mistress arose, everything would be ready, the house warm and clean and ordered, as if by magic rather than by the hard work of poorly paid servants starting their day while it was still dark outside. Asterisk. The city would begin to stir, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The silence of the late night would give way to the first sounds of the day, the clatter of milk cans being set down on doorsteps, the call of a street vendor, the rumble of the first carts and wagons bringing supplies into the city from the surrounding countryside. The darkness would begin to lift, not all at once, but gradually, the sky lightening first from black to dark blue to grey, the gas lamps becoming less necessary, their light fading into insignificance as natural light returned. And with the return of light came the return of London as most people knew it, the city of commerce and crowds, of purposeful activity and organized chaos. The night city, with its mysteries and dangers, its strange beauties and harsh realities, would recede, not disappearing entirely but withdrawing to the margins, waiting for darkness to fall again and bring with it the transformation that happened every evening when the sun set and the lamps were lit. The approaching dawn as the night moved toward its conclusion. There was a particular quality to the darkness in that hour just before dawn, a kind of deep stillness that felt different from the quiet of midnight. It was as if the city had finally, truly relaxed, had let go of the tensions and energies that sustained it through the day and evening. This was the hour when sleep was deepest, when dreams were most vivid, when the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness seemed most permeable. For those who were awake at this hour, whether by choice or necessity, there could be a sense of existing outside of normal time, of occupying a liminal space between one day and the next. The first hints of dawn would come not as light but as a change in the quality of the darkness. The sky, which throughout the night had been uniformly black or perhaps grey with cloud cover, would begin to show differentiation, the eastern horizon taking on a barely perceptible greyness that distinguished it from the darkness above. This change would be so gradual that one could watch for it and still not be certain exactly when it began. But once noticed, it would progress steadily, the grey spreading and lightening, the stars beginning to fade, the sense of the world holding its breath before the return of the sun, for the night workers whose shifts were ending. This approach of dawn brought mixed feelings. There was relief that the long hours of darkness were ending, that soon they could rest, but also exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness that comes from fighting against the body's natural rhythms, staying awake when every instinct calls for sleep. The cab drivers would be making their last runs, hoping for one more fare before returning their vehicles to the stables. The night watchmen would be completing their final rounds, looking forward to going home to whatever rest they could get before evening came, and they had to do it all again for those inside their homes. Warm and safe in their beds, the approach of dawn meant nothing if they remained asleep. But for those who woke early, whether from habit or necessity, there would be that moment of opening one's eyes in the darkness of the bedroom, of lying there in the warmth of blankets and feeling the particular quality of the pre-dawn hours, knowing that the household still slept, that one was alone in one's consciousness for a little while longer. In winter, the bedroom would be cold, the fire having died during the night, breath visible in the air. The prospect of leaving the bed's warmth requiring a certain act of will. The servants, as we noted, would already be up and moving, their footsteps quiet on the stairs, trying not to wake the family as they went about the work of preparing the house for the day. In the kitchen, the range would be relit, the fire built up until the metal glowed with heat, kettles put on to boil, the complex preparations for breakfast begun. In grander households, there would be a hierarchy even among the servants, with the cook directing the kitchen maids, the butler overseeing the footmen, the housekeeper managing the housemaids, all of them working in coordinated choreography to ensure that the visible running of the household appeared effortless. Outside, the streets would begin their transformation back to their daytime character. The gas lamps would still burn, but their light would become less and less necessary as natural light increased. The lamplighters, going about their morning work of extinguishing the lamps, would be moving counter to the awakening city, ending the night even as everyone else was beginning the day. There was something melancholy about this, something that spoke to the cyclical nature of urban life, the way that every ending was also a beginning, every beginning also an ending. The markets would be reaching their peak of activity in these early hours. Covent Garden, that great fruit, vegetable, and flower market in the heart of London, would be a chaos of activity wagons arriving from the countryside with their loads of produce, porters carrying baskets and crates, buyers examining goods and haggling over prices, the air filled with the mingled scents of fresh vegetables, ripe fruit, and the particular sweetness of cut flowers. Billingsgate, the fish market down by the river, would be similarly busy, the catch from the night's fishing unloaded and displayed, the fishmongers calling out their wares, the smell of fresh fish and the salt tang of the sea mixing with the less pleasant odours of the Thames at low tide. These markets were worlds unto themselves, with their own cultures and hierarchies, their own languages almost. the rapid patter of auction calls and market slang incomprehensible to outsiders. The people who worked there, the market porters with their leather helmets and distinctive dress, the sellers and buyers, the hangers-on who made their living in the interstices of the market's economy, formed a community that existed largely apart from the wider city, though intimately connected to it through the daily flow of goods that kept London fed. As dawn proper arrived, the moment when the sun's disk first appeared above the horizon, the quality of light would change dramatically. The grey of pre-dawn would give way to the gold and pink and orange of sunrise. Though how visible this would be depended greatly on the weather and on London's perpetual atmospheric haze. On a clear morning, rare but not impossible, the sunrise could be genuinely beautiful, the light transforming the city's grey stone and brick into warm tones, casting long shadows that would shorten as the sun rose higher. On an overcast morning, which was far more common, the change would be more subtle, simply a general increase in illumination without any dramatic colour show. The birds. London's avian population of pigeons and sparrows and starlings and gulls from the river would begin their morning chorus, though it was a more subdued affair than in the countryside, the birds adapting to the urban environment just as humans had. The sound of birdsong mixing with the increasing sounds of human activity created a complex audio landscape. Nature and civilization intertwined in the peculiar way that characterized city life. The churches would ring their bells for morning services, the sound carrying across the rooftops, calling the faithful to prayer. In a city of 4 million people, there were hundreds of churches, and on a Sunday morning, the bells would create a symphony of sound, different tones and rhythms overlapping and echoing, a sonic reminder of the religious framework that still, in the 1880s, provided structure and meaning to many people's lives, even as the forces of modernization and secularization were beginning to challenge traditional beliefs. For a few moments, in that transition between night and day, both existed simultaneously, the gas lamps still burning while the sun rose, the last of the night workers still about while the first of the day workers appeared, the city caught between two states, neither fully night nor fully day, but something in between. And then the transition would complete. The day would fully establish itself, and the night would retreat, its mysteries and terrors and strange beauties put away until evening came again and the cycle repeated. Conclusion, into sleep, and so we have walked through London's night. From the twilight hour, when the lamplighters began their rounds, to the deep darkness of the late night hours, to the approaching dawn that brought with it the promise of a new day. We have seen the coffee stalls and the hansom cabs, the night watchman and the homeless, the comfortable middle-class parlours and the desperate poverty of the East End tenements. We have walked through the fog along the Thames, felt the cold of unheated bedrooms, heard the silence of streets that during the day never stopped moving. Victorian London at night was a world of contrasts, warmth and cold, light and darkness, comfort and misery, all existing simultaneously within the boundaries of a single city. It was a place where the modern world was being born, where gaslighting and railways and the early stirrings of electrical power coexisted with conditions that would have been familiar to medieval city dwellers. It was a place of extraordinary achievement and crushing poverty, of beautiful architecture and unspeakable slums, of high culture and brutal necessity. To understand this night world is to understand something essential about the Victorian era itself, its ambitions and its blind spots, its confidence and its anxieties, its capacity for both progress and cruelty. The Victorians believed they were building something unprecedented, a new kind of civilization that would bring prosperity and enlightenment to all. And in many ways they succeeded, creating systems and institutions and technologies that would shape the modern world. But they also created or perpetuated suffering on a vast scale, building their prosperity on the backs of working people who lived in conditions of deprivation that are difficult for us to imagine today. The night revealed these contradictions in ways that the day might obscure. In daylight, London could present itself as the capital of the world's greatest empire, a place of order and progress and rational organization. But at night, in the darkness between the gas lamps, the reality was more complex, more troubling, more human in both the best and worst senses of that word. The night was when the city's pretenses fell away, when the gap between rich and poor became visible in the most stark and undeniable ways, when the cost of progress could be measured in the bodies of those who slept rough on the streets, or who worked through the night for wages that would never be enough. Yet there was beauty too in unexpected places, the warm glow of a gas lamp reflecting off rain-slicked cobblestones, the sound of a piano coming from an open window on a summer night, the sight of fog transforming familiar streets into something mysterious and almost magical, the moment of quiet in a middle-class parlor as a family sat together around the fire, safe and warm and together. These moments were real too, as real as the suffering and the struggle, and they deserve to be remembered alongside the darker aspects of Victorian nightlife as you drift toward sleep now. Imagine yourself there one last time. Imagine standing on a London street corner as the last light fades from the sky. The lamplighter passes, his pole reaching up to touch the lamp, and suddenly there is that warm glow, pushing back the darkness just a little. You hear the sound of a hansom cab approaching, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, the creak of the carriage. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of coal smoke and that particular smell that belongs to London alone, compounded of river and stone and the breath of 4 million souls. You turn and walk down the street, the pool of light from the gas lamp growing smaller behind you, the next lamp ahead beckoning like a beacon. Your footsteps echo off the building fronts, keeping time with your heartbeat. The day's concerns are falling away, replaced by the particular peace that comes with darkness. The feeling that the world has shrunk to just this moment, just this street, just the circle of light ahead and the darkness all around. You are walking through history, through a world that existed and then vanished, leaving behind only memories and photographs and the words of those who lived it. The Victorian night is ending now, has been ending for more than a century, fading into memory and imagination. The gas lamps are gone, replaced by electric lights that banish the darkness far more effectively than gas ever could. The fog that was so much a part of London's identity has been cleaned away by legislation and changing patterns of energy use. The hansom cabs have given way to automobiles, the night watchman to modern security systems, the coffee stalls to 24-hour convenience stores. The world has moved on, as it always does, replacing the old with the new, solving some problems while creating others. But on quiet nights, if you know where to look and how to listen, you can still catch glimpses of that vanished world. In the older parts of London, where the Victorian buildings still stand, in the narrow alleys that have somehow escaped redevelopment, in the stretch of the Thames embankment, where you can still walk above the river and imagine the sailing ships and steamers that once crowded its waters. The past is never truly gone, not completely. It lingers in the stones and in the stories, waiting to be remembered. So let that memory be your companion now as you slip into sleep. Let the sound of rain on cobblestones, of distant hoofbeats, of fog-muffled voices be your lullaby. Let the warm glow of the gas lamp guide you gently down into dreams, where perhaps you will find yourself walking those dark streets. One more anonymous figure in the Victorian night, making your way home through the labyrinth of London, safe and peaceful and already half-asleep. The night is deep and quiet now. The lamp burns steady in its glass housing. The city breathes slowly, settling into rest. And you, dear listener, can rest too, knowing that the night will pass, that dawn will come, that the eternal cycle continues in London and everywhere else. In Victorian times and in our own dot, thank you for walking with me through London after midnight. If you enjoyed this journey into the atmospheric past, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Nocturne of History for more explorations of the nights that history has forgotten. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What other vanished nights would you like to explore together? Until we meet again in the quiet hours, may your rest be deep and your dreams be peaceful. Good night from the fog-wrapped streets of Victorian London. Good night.